what do you feel about the emerging anti-globalist movement that has taken shape, notably in the form of the Canadian trucker protests and the various agricultural movements from Sri Lanka to the Netherlands to Germany? What do you feel that the coverage of these populist movements tells us how they are, broadly speaking, smeared and portrayed as like far right or ethno-nationalist? Which is more difficult to do in the case of the Sri Lankan uprising. What do you think it says about the agenda of some of these globalist agencies that do seem to have an influence on the way that nations devise policy, particularly around, for example, the changes around fertilizer that would bankrupt a lot of farmers, which would, as a convenient side effect, leave their independent farms open to centralizing forces. And obviously, we've already touched on Bill Gates' acquisition of farmland across the United States of America. And when we spoke to Vandana Shiva on our show, she said the intention of this act is not to reduce emissions, it's to bankrupt farmers so centralized big agricultural forces can acquire the land and dominate the food and agricultural industries. What do you think about these protest movements, and what do you think about the agenda that they are protesting against? And that's a good enough question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that I agree with your guest that says that for sure they're using these, they use these kind of things that we can all get behind, right? None of us want the world, we all want to benefit our environment. We want to live in a clean, healthy environment, healthy planet. We want these things. And so what they do is they weaponize the things we all want together. And this is how it worked even with wars, right? They weaponize our desire for people to be free. They weaponize our love for democracy. And they're weaponizing our desire to have a clean planet. And they instead use those rather than actually advancing those true causes. They're using them to rile us up. And something that you brought up already earlier, to make us afraid, right? To instill that fear in us, so that we then feel we must do something about this. We must implement these new mandates, or, in the case of these farmers, these mandates against using certain fertilizers, or that they must farm in a certain way. In the Netherlands, they want them to use more natural ways of bringing the nitrogen into the soil. And the way they would have to do that is by using a third of their land to plant like legumes, like beans, and in order to bring that into the soil in a natural way. And many of them don't have farms large enough to be able to give up a third of their land. So they use these motivations that we all desire, and they use that to create this fear in order to get us to go along with certain principles, be it war or these various different, right now, global, this is good for the environment, so we must do it. We're in a crisis. The world is going to end. And that saying to us that the world is going to end makes us very afraid. And I think when it comes to the coverage of these protests, I think that actually has shown more than anything we've seen throughout these last few years and throughout the pandemic, the lack of coverage, I should say, regarding these protests have exposed the fact that the media is no longer reporting on behalf of the people, that the media instead are now reporting on behalf of the corporate elites, the political class, and they're no longer for the people. When we lose the media as the people, when we lose the media, we've lost the battle between ourselves and between the people and the ruling class. When they control the media, we've lost. And that is what we've seen happen now with these protests. These protests are not being covered. I mean, that's just what we're seeing. We're seeing very little coverage. The trucker convoy, when there was any sort of mainstream coverage of it, it was demonized, as you mentioned, as being right-wing, these fascists, these Nazis, they will racist, they call them all these various different names without even addressing what they're actually protesting. Instead, they just smear the people as some sort of lunatics rather than actually covering it. So that showed right there, when you've got thousands of people protesting, hundreds of thousands of people rising up and protesting, and the media's spin on it is pay no attention to the large, massive people over there. They're all a bunch of conspiracy theorists. Pay attention to us. Same thing with what's gone on in the Netherlands. We've seen this throughout even Sri Lanka. Really, protests that have been rising up throughout the world with the French Yellow Vest movement. So even prior to the pandemic, prior to many of these things that are going on more recently, the lack of coverage on these protests where people, thousands, even millions of people coming out, like in the case of India, millions of people coming out, and lack of coverage just goes to, I think, exposes more than anything that the media is no longer for the people. And that is an enormous problem. And then there's those of us who report independently, and we're trying to get the news out there. We're trying to get the information out there to the people. And what happens to you and I, right? We get censored in one way or another. We have to tiptoe around the rules and restrictions of these big tech companies where we put our content on, and we're beholden to those restrictions in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not as much because we don't have an editorial team like what happened to me at the Hill. The editorial team that comes along and says, nope, you're not going to be doing that today. We might not have that, but we do have the big tech companies that are also in cahoots that are then telling us what we can and cannot say if we're going to be using their platforms. So we have lost, and we've got to figure out, we the people have lost, unfortunately. And this is why so many championed Elon Musk taking over Twitter, thinking that we would gain something back, that somebody would come along and help us gain something back. And Trump sort of also embodies that idea. He's so against the establishment, so against, he claims to be, at least he gives the rhetoric. Maybe this time around, if he did win, maybe this time he would really be, because he saw them attack him so viciously. Maybe he didn't understand. I think he maybe underestimated their power and really their power. I mean, he was surrounded, even when he was in office, by people that made him believe they were on his side. And then ultimately they were moles, and they were undercutting him at every turn. So, people are now looking for those figures because we have no choice. We have no hope, actually, without somebody big and powerful coming in at this point and saying, I'm here to make change. Unless, as you mentioned, if we can somehow, we the people, get together and say we demand the change. But many of us have. I mean, look at how many people are watching your show. How people are wanting this change, but how do we go about doing it? That is a whole different, I don't even know how we do it without these big, somehow, hopefully benevolent person comes through like a benevolent king and can grant us our rights back. I mean, but yeah, the protests in particular really exposed that, I mean, we could rise up, we could be in the streets. I mean, in France, they were burning stuff down, and yet, where was the news?
Well, thank you very much for watching that video. I'm so glad that you are a part of this community. Do you think we need a global protest movement that is focused on decentralization, local power wherever possible, ordinary people being involved in politics instead of a corrupt metropolitan professional political class that have no interest or no connection with ordinary people? Let me know what you want. Your will matters. What you think matters. What you feel matters. This is where we can begin a conversation that will not be controlled by those centrist corporate forces. We can have it right now. And if we ever find ourselves in a position where we can't communicate freely on this platform, we will do whatever is necessary to maintain our connection with you, because nothing matters more than that. Hit us up in the comments below, give this video a thumbs up, share it around wherever possible. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. They're both pretty good. Oh, I remember that one. Oh, you were a very good video. And sign up to my mailing list right now in case we ever find ourselves in a position where we need to communicate directly with you. More important than any of that is that you please stay free.